"That seat is for people who matter," she said, her voice slicing clean through the quiet before anyone else could speak, and the room obeyed her before it even understood why. Chairs stilled, fingers froze above tablets. The soft hum of the air conditioning suddenly too loud against the polished glass walls of the 38th floor boardroom overlooking downtown Manhattan, where sunlight spilled in cold and sharp, reflecting off the 12-foot conference table like a mirror no one wanted to look into. Victoria Langford didn't wait for permission. She never did, her heels clicking with measured precision across the marble floor, each step echoing status, confidence, ownership, until she reached the head of the table where one chair sat slightly angled, already occupied, and without hesitation she placed her leather bag down beside it, the soft thud louder than it should have been, and nudged the chair back just enough to claim it, her gaze finally lowering to the man seated there as if noticing him for the first time. Marcus Reed didn't stand, didn't flinch, didn't even tighten his jaw. He simply looked up at her with a calm that didn't match the room, his posture straight but unassuming, charcoal suit unbranded, cufflinks simple, the kind of man people overlooked because nothing about him demanded attention, and yet everything about him held it if you looked long enough. A faint smile touched the corner of Victoria's lips, not warm, not kind, just certain. "You're in the wrong seat," she added, lighter now, almost amused, like correcting a small mistake that should have been obvious. And a few of the executives around the table shifted, some glancing at each other, others lowering their eyes, no one speaking, because they all knew who Victoria was, largest external investor, the woman who moved numbers like pieces on a chessboard, the one whose approval could lift a company or quietly dismantle it over a weekend. Marcus glanced at the chair, then back at her, his fingers brushing once against the edge of the table, slow, deliberate, as if grounding himself in something solid. "Am I?" he asked, his voice low, steady, carrying just enough to reach the far end of the room without forcing itself there. A soft chuckle escaped from someone near the glass wall, quickly stifled, tension slipping in through the cracks. Victoria tilted her head slightly, studying him now, curiosity flickering beneath the surface of her certainty. "Yes," she said, more firmly this time. "That seat is reserved." And she let the word hang. Reserved for someone important, someone who belonged, someone who wasn't him. Marcus's eyes didn't move from hers, not confrontational, not submissive, just present. And for a brief second something shifted, subtle, almost invisible, like the moment before a storm when the air changes pressure. Daniel Price, seated 2 chairs down, leaned forward just enough to glance at the digital agenda displayed on the wall, his brow tightening, fingers hovering over his tablet as if searching for something he couldn't quite name. Marcus exhaled softly, barely noticeable, and adjusted his cuff, the fabric whispering against his wrist, then looked back at Victoria with the same calm. "Are you done?" he asked, and this time the room didn't laugh, because something in the way he said it didn't sound like a question, it sounded like timing, like he was waiting for something to finish before something else began. And for the first time since she walked in, Victoria's smile paused, just for a fraction of a second, before returning sharper than before. "Excuse me," she replied, and somewhere behind her, the glass doors reflected both of them standing and sitting in perfect contrast, power and stillness, assumption and certainty, neither one moving, not yet. The word hung there longer than it should have, stretching across the glass table and bouncing off the silent walls. And for a moment no one moved, not even the assistants near the back who had been quietly typing just seconds ago, because something in his tone did not match the situation. It did not match the man they thought they were looking at. Victoria straightened slightly, her fingers tightening around the edge of the chair she had just claimed, the polished metal cool beneath her grip, and she let out a short, controlled breath before stepping closer, close enough now to see the fine stitching on his suit, the subtle wear at the edge of his cuff as if it had been used often, not displayed. "I think you misunderstand how this works," she said, her voice lower now, quieter but sharper, like a blade drawn instead of raised, and a few heads nodded instinctively around the table, aligning themselves with her authority without needing instruction. Marcus did not look away, his gaze steady, almost patient, as if he had heard variations of this moment before, not identical, but familiar. the same assumptions dressed in different voices, and he rested his hand flat against the table, fingertips barely touching the surface, feeling the faint vibration of the building beneath them. 38 floors above the street, where traffic moved in steady lines like veins carrying something unseen. Daniel shifted again, this time more noticeably, his tablet lighting up as he swiped through a document, his brow pulling tighter with each page, the reflection of the screen flickering across his glasses, and he glanced up briefly at Marcus, then back down, as if confirming something he did not want to say out loud just yet. This seat is reserved for the acting chair of the board, Victoria continued, her tone regaining confidence as she spoke, each word placed carefully, publicly, making sure the room heard her. So unless you are here to present, you should probably find another place to sit. And there it was, the dismissal wrapped in politeness, the kind that did not sound like an insult unless you were the one receiving it. A faint murmur passed through the room, subtle but present, like wind brushing against tall glass. And one of the junior executives near the far end glanced at the agenda screen again, then quickly looked away, choosing silence over uncertainty. Marcus tilted his head just slightly, not in defiance, not in submission, just enough to acknowledge the statement. And then he leaned back an inch, the leather chair creaking softly. Beneath him, a small sound that somehow carried farther than it should have. "I see," he said, calm, measured, and for a brief second it almost sounded like agreement, like he might stand, like he might step aside and let the moment pass the way everyone expected it to. But he did not move, not even an inch. Victoria waited, her expression fixed, confident, expecting compliance, because that was how these moments usually ended, with quiet correction and restored order. But the seconds stretched, 1, 2, 3, and nothing changed except the air, which grew tighter, heavier, as if the room itself was holding its breath. Daniel finally looked up fully, his voice low but clear enough to cut through the silence. "Victoria," he said carefully, not breaking eye contact with his screen, "you might want to check the ownership file." And that was the first crack, small but undeniable, and it landed between them like something fragile that could either be ignored or shatter everything, depending on who touched it next. Victoria's eyes flicked toward him, irritation flashing for just a moment before she masked it. "I am quite aware of the ownership structure," she replied smoothly, but there was a slight delay before the words came out, just enough to be noticed by the few who were paying close attention. Marcus watched that flicker, that hesitation, and for the first time his fingers tapped once against the table. A single quiet sound, not impatient, not aggressive, just a marker in time, as if something had just begun rather than ended. The tap of his finger did not echo, but it landed, a single point in time that seemed to ripple outward through the room. And suddenly every small detail felt louder, the faint hum of the overhead lights, the distant honk of traffic 38 floors below, the soft shift of fabric as someone crossed their legs and immediately stilled again. Victoria held her posture, chin slightly raised, eyes fixed on Marcus as if holding eye contact alone could restore the balance she was used to. But something in the room had already tilted, subtle but undeniable, like a picture frame no longer perfectly aligned. Daniel cleared his throat quietly, not to interrupt, but because the silence had grown too heavy to carry without breaking, and he turned his tablet slightly, angling it toward Victoria just enough for her to see, though he did not push it forward, did not force the moment. He simply let the information exist between them. "There was an update filed last quarter," he said, carefully choosing each word, his voice steady but restrained. It changed the controlling interest, and the phrasing was deliberate, neutral, but the implication sat just beneath it, waiting to be acknowledged. Victoria did not look down immediately, and that hesitation stretched long enough for a few people around the table to notice, long enough for uncertainty to take its first real breath in the room. And when she finally glanced at the screen, it was quick, almost dismissive, as if expecting to confirm what she already believed, but her eyes paused, just for a fraction of a second too long, before she pulled back, her expression tightening ever so slightly at the corners. Marcus watched the shift without reacting, his face calm, unreadable, his presence grounded in a way that did not demand attention yet refused to be moved, and he leaned forward just a little now, resting his forearms lightly against the edge of the table, closing the distance by inches rather than force. Structures change, he said quietly, not correcting her, not challenging her, just placing the statement into the air like a fact that did not need approval. A murmur flickered again, softer this time, less confident. And one of the senior board members near the window adjusted his glasses, leaning closer to his own screen, scanning, verifying, as if the room had collectively decided to double-check reality. Victoria exhaled slowly through her nose, her fingers releasing the edge of the chair as she straightened fully, reclaiming composure through posture, through stillness, the way someone does when they refuse to let a moment define them. Even if that were true, she said, her voice smoother now, controlled again. This meeting has an order, and you are not on the presenting list. And there it was again, the attempt to reframe, to shift. The focus away from ownership and back to procedure, to something she could still control. Marcus's gaze did not waver, but there was a faint change now, not in his expression, but in the timing of his breath. Slower, more deliberate, as if he had reached the point he had been waiting for all along. And his hand moved slightly across the table, brushing the edge of a folder that had been sitting there the entire time, untouched, unnoticed, its cover plain, almost intentionally so. Daniel noticed it first, his eyes flicking from the tablet to the folder and back again, and his lips parted as if to say something, then closed, choosing silence once more, because whatever was about to happen no longer needed explanation. Marcus slid the folder forward an inch, not opening it, not presenting it, just moving it into the space between them, and the sound of paper against glass was soft but precise, a line drawn without words. You are right, he said, his voice calm. Even, this meeting does have an order. And for the first time since she entered the room, Victoria did not respond immediately, her gaze dropping briefly to the folder before returning to his face, and something in her eyes shifted, not fear, not yet, but awareness, the kind that arrives just before everything changes. The word order lingered in the air like something fragile, something that could either settle or shatter depending on what came next. And for a brief second no one reached for their screens, no one typed, no one even shifted in their seats, because the moment had moved beyond routine and into something else entirely. Victoria's eyes dropped again to the folder, this time slower, more deliberate, as if the simple object carried more weight than it should, and her fingers hovered just above its edge without touching it. Not yet, while the reflection of her hand trembled faintly on the glass surface beneath. Marcus did not push it closer, did not open it, did not explain. He simply waited, his stillness more commanding than any raised voice could have been, his presence anchored in a quiet certainty that no longer needed to prove itself. Daniel leaned back slightly now, his tablet resting against the table, forgotten for the moment, his attention fixed entirely on the exchange, unfolding in front of him, because whatever was inside that folder had already begun to rewrite the room before it was even revealed. Victoria finally let her fingertips brush against the cover, the texture smooth, unremarkable, almost intentionally plain, and she flipped it open with controlled precision, the soft sound of paper turning echoing far louder than it should have in the silence. Her eyes scanned the first page quickly, confidently at first, then slower, the rhythm breaking as lines of text settled into meaning. And the faintest crease appeared between her brows, subtle but unmistakable, the kind that does not come from confusion alone but from recognition. Across the table, one of the senior executives leaned forward just enough to catch a glimpse, his lips parting slightly before pressing together again, his gaze shifting from the document to Marcus and back, as if recalibrating everything he thought he understood. Marcus watched without interruption, his gaze steady, not on the document, but on Victoria herself, as if the real shift was not in the paper but in her reaction to it, in the way her posture adjusted by degrees too small for most to notice, her shoulders no longer perfectly squared, her breath no longer perfectly timed. There must be a mistake, she said finally, her voice measured but thinner now, lacking the effortless weight it carried before, and she turned another page, then another, each movement slightly quicker than the last, searching, verifying, hoping for something to contradict what was already becoming clear. Daniel exhaled quietly, almost imperceptibly, and glanced at the others around the table, catching the same realization spreading in silent waves, one person at a time, as screens were checked, files reopened, confirmations made without a single word spoken aloud. Marcus's hand moved again, not toward the folder but toward the center of the table, where his fingers rested lightly against the glass, grounding himself in the same quiet rhythm as before. And when he spoke, his voice was unchanged, calm, even, unhurried. It was filed 3 months ago, he said, offering the information without emphasis, without satisfaction, as if it were simply part of the timeline rather than a turning point. Victoria looked up sharply, her eyes locking onto his, searching for something in his expression that might explain what she was seeing. But there was nothing there to challenge, nothing there to argue with, only a calm that now felt heavier than before, more defined, less ignorable. "You are saying," she began, stopping briefly as if the words themselves required adjustment, "that this structure gives you controlling authority," and the room seemed to lean in collectively, every person present waiting for the confirmation they already suspected. Marcus held her gaze for a moment longer, then gave the smallest nod, not dramatic, not triumphant, just final, and the silence that followed was no longer uncertain. It was settled, like dust after something unseen had already shifted into place. The nod did not come with force, but it carried weight, the kind that settled into the room and pressed against every surface, every screen, every unspoken assumption that had filled the space just minutes before. And for a moment Victoria did not move, her fingers still resting on the open pages as if letting go would make the words disappear. But they did not. They stayed, fixed and undeniable, printed in quiet black ink that did not need to raise its voice. The city outside the glass continued without interruption, taxis flowing in steady lines, sunlight glinting off distant windows, unaware that inside this room something far more fragile had just shifted. Victoria closed the folder slowly, the soft thud echoing again. But this time it did not sound like control. It sounded like containment, like she was trying to hold something from spilling further, and she straightened, drawing a careful breath, rebuilding herself piece by piece the way people do when they realize they have stepped into something deeper than expected. "If that is accurate," she said, her tone measured, each word placed deliberately as if tested before being released, "then it should have been communicated to the board more directly." And there it was, not denial, not acceptance, but a redirection, a reach for structure, for process, for anything that could restore balance. Marcus listened without interruption, his expression unchanged, but there was a quiet shift in his posture now, a subtle settling, as if the moment he had been waiting for had fully arrived, and there was no longer any need to hold back what came next. And his gaze moved briefly across the room, not searching, not seeking approval, just acknowledging the presence of everyone who had watched this unfold. Daniel leaned forward again, his voice softer now, no longer cautious but certain. "It was disclosed," he said, glancing between them, "in the quarterly filing and the shareholder update." And he paused just long enough for the implication to land, that the information had been there, visible, accessible, simply not seen. A quiet shift rippled through the room, not loud, not dramatic, but enough to be felt. As a few executives adjusted their posture, their attention now fully aligned with Marcus in a way it had not been before. Victoria's eyes flickered briefly toward Daniel, then back to Marcus, and for the first time there was something else in her expression, not just control, not just calculation, but the early trace of realization. The kind that does not announce itself, but changes everything once it settles in. Marcus's fingers moved once more against the table, a light tap, slower this time. And when he spoke his voice remained calm, steady, almost quiet, but it carried further than before because the room was no longer resisting it. "Communication only works," he said, "when people are willing to see what is in front of them." And the sentence did not accuse, did not confront. It simply existed, a statement placed carefully into the space between them. Victoria held his gaze, and for a moment it seemed as though she might respond immediately, might push back, might reclaim the ground she had lost. But the words did not come as quickly this time, and the pause stretched just long enough for the shift to become visible to everyone watching. Marcus leaned forward slightly, closing the remaining distance by inches. His presence no longer something that could be overlooked or redirected, and his voice, still even, still controlled, carried the final piece of what had been building since the moment she walked in. "So let us begin this meeting properly," he said, his eyes steady on hers, with the correct understanding of who was actually leading it. And the silence that followed was no longer uncertain. It was defined, shaped by a truth that had finally been spoken out loud. The word leading did not echo, but it settled, heavy and precise. And for a moment no one spoke because there was nothing left to question, only something to accept. And acceptance moved slower than shock, slower than pride. It moved through the room in quiet adjustments, in the way shoulders lowered by an inch, in the way eyes shifted without permission. Victoria stood there still, the folder now closed beneath her hand, her posture intact but no longer unshaken, and she drew in a measured breath, the kind people take when they are deciding what version of themselves to present next, because the moment had already taken something from her, and she could feel it, not in what was said, but in what was no longer hers to control. Marcus did not rush the silence. He did not fill it. He let it exist, let it settle into every corner of the room until it became part of the structure itself, and then he moved. Not abruptly, not forcefully, but with quiet intention, his hand sliding toward the chair she had claimed, his fingers resting lightly on the backrest as if acknowledging its place rather than taking it. Victoria's eyes followed the movement instantly, sharp, aware, and for a brief second there was resistance there, instinctive, unspoken, the reflex to hold ground even when the ground had already shifted beneath her. Daniel watched closely, his attention fixed not on the chair but on the space between them, because that space now carried more meaning than any document or title ever could. Marcus paused, just long enough for the moment to register, for the room to feel the weight of what was about to happen. And then he spoke again, his voice calm, even, untouched by tension. "You can keep the seat," he said, and the sentence did not land the way anyone expected it to, because it was not a concession, it was something else entirely. A few heads turned, subtle, confused, trying to understand. Because power, when it had just been established, was not usually given away, not even in part, and yet he had just done exactly that, or at least it seemed that way on the surface. Victoria blinked once, the smallest break in her composure, her hand tightening slightly against the folder as she processed the words, and for the first time since she walked in, she did not immediately respond, because the rules she was used to did not quite apply anymore. Marcus continued, his gaze steady, his tone unchanged. "A seat does not decide who leads," he added, each word placed carefully, not as a correction, not as a challenge, but as a truth that did not require agreement, and the room felt it, not as pressure, but as clarity. One of the executives near the far end shifted in his chair, straightening instinctively, as if aligning himself with something more stable than before, while another quietly closed a file on his tablet, no longer needing to verify what had already become evident. Victoria's shoulders eased just slightly, not in defeat, but in recalibration, her mind moving quickly now, reorganizing, reassessing, and when she finally spoke, her voice was controlled again, but different, stripped of something that had been there earlier, something sharper, more absolute. "Then proceed," she said, and the words were simple, but they carried a new weight, because they were no longer instructions, they were acknowledgement. Marcus gave a small nod, almost imperceptible, and moved past the chair without taking it, choosing instead the space beside it, his presence no longer defined by position, but by something far less visible and far more stable. And as he placed his hands lightly on the table once more, the room shifted again, this time not in tension, but in alignment, as if everyone present had silently agreed on something without needing it to be stated. And for the first time since the meeting began, the silence did not feel heavy, it felt clear. The word proceed did not sound like permission, but it moved through the room like one, quiet and undeniable, and for a moment the space seemed to reset itself, not completely, but enough for the rhythm of the meeting to return in a different form. Slower, more deliberate, as if every movement now carried awareness of what had just happened. Marcus did not rush into speaking. He let the shift settle, his hands resting lightly against the edge of the table, fingers relaxed, posture steady. And when he finally turned his attention toward the screen at the front of the room, the movement was small, controlled, but it redirected everyone else with it. One by one, eyes lifting, screens dimming, attention aligning without instruction, Daniel adjusted his tablet again, this time not searching but preparing, pulling up the presentation file with a quiet efficiency that reflected the change in tone, and he glanced briefly at Marcus, not for approval, but in recognition of the new order that had formed without being formally declared. Victoria remained standing for a second longer than necessary, the chair still just behind her, her hand resting against its back as if deciding whether to sit or remain where she was. And then, slowly, she took the seat, not with the same certainty as before, but with intention, controlled, measured, her posture still straight, her expression composed. But something in the way she settled into it was different, less about claiming and more about holding position. Marcus noticed, but he did not react, his focus already shifting forward. And as the first slide appeared on the screen, a simple title page reflecting projected numbers and strategic outlines, the light from it cast a soft glow across the table, catching in the reflections of glass and polished surfaces, blending faces and figures into overlapping layers that made it harder to distinguish who held what role just moments ago. Let us begin with the revised projections, Marcus said, his voice calm, even, carrying easily across the room now without resistance, and no one interrupted, no one questioned the transition. Because the authority in his tone no longer needed validation, it had already been established in silence. One of the analysts near the far end leaned forward, taking notes again, the faint scratch of pen against paper returning like a signal that the meeting had resumed, but not as it was before. Victoria's eyes moved to the screen, following the data as it appeared, her expression focused, analytical, the professional instinct returning quickly. But beneath it, there was a trace of something else, a quiet recalibration, as if she were now measuring not just the numbers, but the man presenting them. Marcus continued, guiding the discussion without raising his voice, without forcing direction, his words precise, his pauses intentional, allowing space for information to land, for others to follow, and the room responded in kind, questions coming at the right moments, responses measured, the flow of conversation aligning naturally around him. Daniel contributed where needed, supporting details, clarifying figures, his tone steady, but even he seemed more attuned to Marcus's rhythm now, adjusting without effort. Victoria remained silent through the first segment, listening, observing, her fingers lightly tapping once against the armrest before going still again. And when she finally spoke, her voice was controlled, professional, but no longer dismissive. Those projections assume a stable margin over the next 2 quarters, she said, her eyes still on the screen. What changes if that margin compresses by even 5%? And the question landed differently than anything she had said before, not as a challenge to authority, but as engagement with it. Marcus turned slightly toward her, acknowledging the question with a small nod, and for a brief moment their eyes met again, not in opposition this time, but in something more balanced, more defined. And the room, quietly, almost imperceptibly, recognized that something deeper than control had shifted, something that would not easily return to what it had been. The question did not challenge him, but it tested the space between them, and for a brief moment the room leaned in again, not out of tension this time, but out of attention sharpened by what had already unfolded. Marcus did not answer immediately, his gaze shifting from Victoria to the projection, the numbers glowing softly against the glass. Percentages and projections layered over one another like quiet predictions of a future that had not yet decided itself, and he let the silence stretch just enough for the question to settle, for everyone to consider it before he spoke. Then we adjust before it happens, he said, his voice even, not defensive, not reactive, just precise. And he stepped slightly to the side, reaching toward the screen with a small gesture that brought up a secondary set of figures. Contingency models already built, already waiting. As if the scenario she had raised had been accounted for long before it was spoken, a subtle shift moved through the room again, quieter than before but deeper, as a few heads nodded almost instinctively, recognizing preparation rather than reaction. and Daniel glanced at the updated slide, his lips pressing together in brief acknowledgement before he began scrolling through his own notes, aligning with the direction without needing instruction. Victoria's eyes followed the change on the screen, scanning the new data, her expression tightening just slightly in concentration, not in resistance, and her fingers stilled completely now against the armrest, no longer tapping, no longer marking time. As if she had shifted from controlling the pace to understanding it, Marcus continued, his tone steady, guiding rather than asserting. If the margin compresses by 5%, we reduce exposure in the second quarter, not the third, he said, and he tapped once against the table, a quiet emphasis that drew attention without demanding it. And we reallocate before the pressure compounds. And the clarity in his explanation did not leave room for confusion, only for response. One of the senior executives near the window leaned forward, adjusting his glasses. That would require early signaling from operations, he said carefully, testing the structure rather than the authority, and Marcus nodded once, acknowledging the point before it fully landed. It is already in place, he replied, and again there was no need to elevate his voice, because the room was already listening. Daniel looked up at that, a faint shift in his expression as he cross-checked the statement, and then gave a small, almost imperceptible nod of his own, confirming what had just been said without speaking it aloud. Victoria exhaled slowly, her gaze still fixed on the screen, but there was something different now in the way she held her focus, less guarded, more engaged, as if she were no longer measuring him against her expectations, but measuring the work itself, the structure, the foresight, the quiet precision behind it. She leaned forward slightly, resting her forearms against the table, closing the distance not as a challenge, but as participation. And if the compression exceeds that threshold, she asked, her voice calm, steady, but no longer edged, what is your ceiling before we shift strategy entirely? And the question landed not as resistance, but as collaboration, a line drawn forward rather than across. Marcus met her gaze again, and for a brief second there was recognition there, not personal, not emotional, but professional, the kind that forms when two people finally operate within the same frame. And he nodded once more, slower this time, before answering. Then we do not wait for the ceiling, he said quietly. We redefine it. And the room, without anyone needing to say it, understood that whatever had shifted earlier had not only settled, it had begun to build into something stronger. The word redefine did not feel like an answer. It felt like a shift in gravity, and for a moment the room held still again, not because it was unsure, but because it recognized something it had not expected to find, a level of control that did not rely on reacting to pressure, but on shaping it before it could take form. Victoria did not look away this time, her eyes steady on Marcus as the meaning settled. And there was a pause, not long, but intentional, the kind that separates instinct from thought. And when she leaned back slightly in her chair, it was not retreat, it was recalibration. The screen continued to glow with projections, numbers adjusting as Daniel quietly updated the model in real time, the faint tapping of his fingers returning like a steady rhythm beneath the conversation, and one by one the others around the table followed, pulling up data, cross-checking assumptions, aligning themselves with the direction that had been set without being formally declared. Marcus stepped back just enough to let the room breathe, his presence still central but no longer needing to occupy every second. And he watched as the discussion began to move on its own, questions forming, answers building, the structure holding. One of the analysts near the far end raised a point about regional exposure, his voice careful but confident, and Marcus nodded once, listening fully before responding, not interrupting, not overriding, but guiding the thread forward with a single adjustment that clarified more than it corrected. Victoria observed all of it, the flow, the rhythm, the way the room responded to him, and something in her expression softened, not in weakness, but in recognition, the kind that comes when a pattern finally makes sense, when what seemed out of place reveals itself as the center. She glanced down briefly at the closed folder beside her, the same one that had shifted everything, and her fingers rested on it for a moment, not opening it. Again, not needing to, because what it represented had already moved beyond paper. When she looked back up, her focus returned to Marcus, But the angle had changed, no longer measuring, no longer challenging, but understanding, and when she spoke again, her voice carried a different tone, still precise, still controlled, but aligned now with the direction of the room. Then the priority is not just protection, she said, her gaze steady. It is anticipation, and the statement did not ask for confirmation, it extended the framework. Marcus met her words with a slight nod, acknowledging not just the point, but the shift behind it, and he moved a step closer to the table again, his hand resting lightly against the surface, grounding the next part of the discussion. Exactly, he said, and there was no hesitation in the agreement, no need to qualify it, because it fit. Daniel glanced between them briefly, catching the exchange, the alignment that had formed where opposition once stood, and he adjusted the projection once more, refining the model to reflect the direction now being shaped from both sides. The room followed, not because it was told to, but because it recognized the coherence in what was being built, and for the first time since the meeting began, the energy was not divided. It was unified, quiet but strong, like a structure that had found its balance. Victoria leaned forward slightly again, her forearms resting against the table, her posture mirroring the engagement she had resisted earlier, and as the conversation continued, it became clear that the shift had gone beyond control or authority. It had settled into something deeper, something that did not need to be declared to be understood, and Marcus, without raising his voice, without changing his tone, had become the center of it. The room no longer felt divided, but it was not entirely at ease either, because alignment did not erase what had happened, it only reshaped it, and that quiet awareness lingered beneath every word, every glance, like a current running just under the surface. Marcus stood steady at the edge of the table, his presence no longer something to establish, but something to maintain, and he let the conversation move for a moment without him, watching how it held, how each voice entered and exited. Without disrupting the structure that had formed, Daniel adjusted the projections again, layering in additional variables, the soft glow of the screen reflecting across his glasses as he worked, and he paused briefly before speaking. There is one more factor we have not accounted for, he said, his tone careful but firm, and the room shifted its attention toward him without hesitation. Marcus turned slightly, acknowledging the shift with a small movement of his head, giving space rather than taking it, and Daniel continued. External pressure from Langford Capital, he added, glancing briefly toward Victoria before returning his focus to the data. If their position changes, it could affect our stability faster than projected, and the words settled differently than the others, not technical, not abstract, but personal, tied directly to the balance that had just been redefined. A faint pause followed, subtle but present, and for the first time since the meeting regained its rhythm. The alignment wavered, not enough to break, but enough to be felt. Victoria did not react immediately, her expression remaining composed, but her fingers shifted slightly against the table, a small movement that did not go unnoticed, and she leaned back just enough to create distance, not from the discussion, but from the implication within it. Marcus watched the moment carefully, not stepping in too quickly, allowing it to unfold naturally, and when he spoke, his voice remained calm, measured, unchanged by the shift in direction. Positions change when they are not aligned with the outcome, he said, his gaze steady, not accusatory, not defensive, simply stating what had already been demonstrated, and the room absorbed it without resistance. Victoria's eyes lifted to meet his, and for a brief second there was tension there again, not the sharp edge from before, but something quieter, more internal, as if she were weighing not just the strategy, but her own place within it. The city outside continued in silent motion, sunlight shifting slightly across the glass as time moved forward without pause, and inside, the meeting held that same forward motion. Even as the conversation touched something more personal than before, Daniel glanced between them, aware of the balance, and then returned to the data, refining the projection to reflect multiple outcomes, giving structure to what might otherwise remain uncertain. Marcus stepped closer to the screen, his hand lifting just enough to indicate a section of the model. Then we prepare for that shift as well, he said, not avoiding the point, not diminishing it, but integrating it into the framework. We do not wait for alignment, we build through it. and the clarity in his tone left no space for hesitation, only for decision. Victoria held his gaze for a moment longer, and then, slowly, she nodded. Not large, not dramatic, but real, a small acknowledgement that carried more weight than any earlier assertion. And when she spoke again, her voice was steady, composed, but changed in a way that could not be undone. "Then you will have it," she said, and the words did not clarify immediately what she meant, but the room understood the direction, the implication, the shift that had moved from resistance to participation. Marcus did not react outwardly, but there was a quiet stillness in him that marked the moment, not as a victory, but as a turning point. And as the discussion continued, the structure that had formed earlier did not just hold, it strengthened, built now not on assumption or position, but on something far more difficult to create and far more difficult to take away. The words "then you will have it" did not echo, but they stayed, settling into the room with a quiet weight that no one tried to interrupt. And for a moment, even the movement of the city outside seemed distant, as if the glass itself had thickened, holding everything inside this space a little longer than usual. Marcus did not respond immediately, not because he needed time, but because he understood the value of it, the way a pause could carry meaning without forcing it into words, and he let that meaning exist, unchallenged, before shifting his gaze briefly toward the screen, then back to Victoria. She remained composed, her posture steady, but something in her stillness had changed, not weakened, not diminished, but softened at the edges, like a structure that had been reinforced from within rather than held up from the outside. And her hand rested flat against the table now, no longer gripping, no longer marking control, just present. Daniel adjusted the projection once more, integrating the new variables, the soft flicker of numbers updating across the display, reflecting in layers on the polished surface below. And he glanced toward Marcus as if to confirm the direction, but the confirmation was already there, embedded in the flow of the room itself. Marcus stepped slightly closer to the center of the table, not taking the head position, not claiming it, but standing within the space that now naturally aligned around him. And when he spoke again, his voice carried the same calm precision. "Then we move forward with the revised structure," he said, and there was no hesitation in the statement, no need to reinforce it, because it had already been accepted. One of the board members near the far end nodded quietly, making a note, while another adjusted his screen to match the updated model, and the rhythm of the meeting resumed fully, but with a clarity that had not been there before. Victoria watched him for a moment longer, not evaluating now, not measuring, but observing, and when she finally spoke again, her tone was steady, aligned. "You will have full support from Langford Capital on this direction," she said, and this time the words were clear, specific, leaving no room for ambiguity. And a subtle shift passed through the room, not dramatic, but meaningful, as the final piece of resistance gave way to alignment. Marcus gave a small nod, acknowledging the statement without overstating it, and his gaze moved briefly across the room, taking in the others, the subtle confirmations, the quiet acceptance that had formed without announcement. The meeting continued, numbers refined, strategies clarified, voices entering and exiting with purpose, but beneath it all, something else had settled, something that went beyond projections or positions, something that had reshaped the way each person in the room now understood the man who stood among them. Victoria leaned back slightly in her chair, her eyes following the discussion as it moved forward, and for a brief second her gaze returned to the folder at her side, the one that had changed everything without raising its voice. And she did not open it again. She did not need to, because what it represented was no longer confined to paper. It had already moved into the room, into the structure, into the way things now worked. Marcus rested his hand lightly against the table once more, the same quiet gesture from before, grounding the moment without drawing attention to it. And as the sunlight shifted across the glass, catching the edges of the table and the reflections of those seated around it, the room no longer felt like a place where power was taken or defended, but something else entirely, something quieter, more stable, and far more difficult to ignore. The meeting did not end with a single moment. It unfolded gradually, like something settling into place after being moved, and the rhythm that had formed held steady as the final points were reviewed, numbers confirmed, timelines aligned, each voice now entering with clarity instead of caution. Marcus stood where he had been, not at the head, not claiming the position that had once defined the room, but occupying something far more stable. And as he guided the last segment of discussion, his tone remained unchanged, calm, precise, allowing others to follow without forcing direction. Daniel closed out the final projection with a quiet tap, the screen dimming slightly as the data locked into its final state, and he leaned back just enough to signal completion without announcing it, his gaze shifting across the table as if marking the end of something that had gone far beyond numbers. One by one, the others began to gather their materials, tablets dimming, folders closing, pens set down with soft, measured sounds that echoed lightly against the glass and marble, and yet no one stood immediately, as if the room itself was holding them there for just a moment longer, recognizing that what had happened could not be rushed past. Victoria remained seated, her posture still composed, but quieter now, her hand resting near the folder that had once held all the weight of the moment, and she glanced at it briefly before looking up again, her eyes finding Marcus not by instinct, but by choice. He noticed, but did not call attention to it, his focus shifting naturally toward the close of the meeting. "We will circulate the updated structure by end of day," he said, his voice steady, not seeking agreement, simply stating what would follow, and the room responded with small nods, quiet acknowledgments that required no further discussion. A few of the executives began to rise, chairs sliding back softly, the faint sound of movement returning to the space, but slower than usual, more deliberate, as if each person was still processing what they had witnessed beneath the surface of the meeting itself. Victoria stood as well, smoothing the front of her jacket with a controlled motion, her composure intact, but her presence different now, less defined by the space around her and more by the way she chose to stand within it. For a moment, she hesitated, not in uncertainty, but in consideration, and then she stepped forward, closing the small distance that had once felt much larger. Marcus turned slightly as she approached, his posture relaxed, his expression calm, and the room, though beginning to disperse, seemed to quiet again just enough to hold the exchange. Victoria met his gaze, steady, direct, and for the first time since she entered the room, there was no edge in her voice, no need to assert, only clarity. "I should have looked closer," she said, and the words were simple, but they carried something deeper than acknowledgement, something closer to understanding. Marcus held her gaze for a moment, not correcting, not dismissing, and then he gave a small nod, accepting the statement without expanding it, without turning it into something larger than it needed to be. The pause that followed was brief, but complete, and Victoria stepped back slightly, not retreating, but allowing the moment to settle where it belonged, around them. The room continued to empty, the quiet hum of the building returning to the foreground as voices lowered and footsteps moved toward the door, and Marcus remained where he was for a second longer, his hand resting lightly against the table once more, the same gesture that had grounded him from the beginning. The sunlight shifted again across the glass, catching the edge of the chair that had started it all, and for a moment it stood empty, no longer a symbol of control or position, but just a place, unchanged, while everything around it had moved. The room emptied without ceremony, chairs sliding back into place, footsteps fading into the hallway, the low murmur of voices dissolving into the distance until only silence remained. And for a moment it felt larger than before, not because it had grown, but because something inside it had shifted and settled into a new shape. Marcus stood alone at the edge of the table, his hand resting lightly against the glass, the same quiet anchor he had carried through every moment, and he did not move. Immediately, as if allowing the space to return to itself before he left it behind, the sunlight stretched across the floor in long, clean lines, catching the edges of the table, the empty chairs, the faint outline of where people had just been, and at the head of it all, the seat remained untouched, no longer claimed, no longer contested, simply there. Marcus glanced at it once, not with ownership, not with victory, but with a calm understanding, and then his gaze moved past it, toward the city beyond the glass, where everything continued without pause, unchanged by what had just taken place 38 floors above. The door behind him opened softly, not with urgency, but with intention, and Victoria stepped back into the room, her heels quieter now against the marble, her presence no longer announced but simply there, and she stopped a few feet away, not approaching fully, not holding distance, just standing within the space as it now existed. Marcus turned slightly, acknowledging her without surprise, and the silence between them was no longer heavy, no longer uncertain. It was clear, defined by everything that had already been said and everything that no longer needed to be. Victoria looked toward the table, her eyes passing briefly over the empty seat before returning to him, and there was a stillness in her expression, not guarded, not defensive, but reflective, as if she were seeing the room for the first time without the lens she had carried in before. "You never corrected me," she said quietly, her voice steady, not accusing, not apologizing, simply stating what she had realized. And the words lingered for a moment before settling. Marcus held her gaze, his posture relaxed, and there was no urgency in his response, only clarity. "You were not ready to hear it," he said, and the sentence was simple, but it carried no judgment, no edge, just truth placed gently into the space between them. Victoria let out a slow breath, the kind that comes when something finally aligns, and she nodded once, small but real, her eyes drifting briefly back to the chair, then to the city beyond, and then back to him, as if tracing the path of the moment that had brought her here. "I understand that now," she said, and there was no hesitation in the words, no need to explain them further. Marcus gave a slight nod in return, acknowledging the shift without expanding it, without turning it into something larger than it needed to be, and he stepped away from the table at last, his hand leaving the glass, the faint reflection of it disappearing as he moved. The room remained still, the light unchanged, the chair unmoved, and as Marcus walked toward the door, he did not look back, because there was nothing left behind that needed to be claimed. Victoria stayed where she was for a moment longer, her gaze following the quiet space he had occupied, and then she turned toward the table, her hand resting briefly against its surface, feeling the cool glass beneath her fingertips, grounding herself in the same stillness he had carried. Outside, the city continued, steady and indifferent, but inside the room, something had shifted in a way that would not be undone, not by position, not by voice, not by assumption. And as the door closed softly behind him, the silence that followed did not feel empty, it felt complete.